Imagine a scenario. You find yourself among people engrossed in trivial conversations, the latest gossip, and shallow news. The discussions revolve around repetitive themes, leading to no meaningful conclusions. You attempt to contribute, sharing deeper thoughts and interesting reflections, but are met with blank stares and abrupt topic changes. Worse, there's a feeling that your words are misunderstood. In such moments, the realization dawns. Perhaps it's better to remain silent. If this feeling resonates with you, know that you're not alone. However, the root of the problem doesn't lie within you. The truth is, high intelligence often doesn't bring people closer. It creates a chasm between them. The deeper your understanding of the complexity of the world around you, the harder it becomes to find like-minded individuals who share your perspective. Don't be deceived into thinking that intellectual loneliness is merely a figment of your imagination. Society subconsciously rejects those who think outside the box. Arthur Schopenhauer, one of the most forthright and uncompromising philosophers in history, argued that exceptional intelligence is not a blessing but rather a curse. It's a burden that dooms a person to isolation, allowing them to see the true picture of the world, hidden behind the veil of everyday bustle. In his view, the clearer you become aware of the contradictions that permeate our reality, the harder it becomes to convey them to those who are content with a superficial view of things. Ultimately, most people seek not truth but comfort and tranquility. So the logical question arises: if sharpness of mind leads to alienation, where can one find salvation? How can one exist in a society where a different mindset prevails? If you've ever felt detached, a gnawing emptiness due to the lack of intellectual connection, it's worth paying attention to the following. Perhaps the root of the problem lies not in loneliness itself, but in the aspects of the surrounding world that it illuminates. Is intelligence a blessing or a heavy burden? Theoretically, heightened mental abilities should ease the path of life. Rapid assimilation of information, identification of hidden connections, avoidance of common mistakes. However, in practice, it is intelligence, intended to be an advantage that erects an invisible barrier between the individual and the rest of the world. Arthur Schopenhauer deeply understood this dilemma, asserting that an outstanding mind condemns a person to a solitary existence because most people do not strive for deep analysis. And it's not a matter of lacking ability, but of lacking social benefit. Why delve into philosophical reflections, question established dogmas, expose the hypocrisy of social institutions if it only leads to discomfort and misunderstanding? For the average person, life flows more smoothly and simply when they accept the world in its immutable givenness, without bothering themselves with complex questions and deep analysis. However, there is a category of people whose minds know no rest, constantly analyzing, singling out details that escape the gaze of most. They unerringly recognize the lies people tell themselves, hiding behind illusions to avoid confronting harsh reality. Inevitable disappointment befalls them when attempts to convey the truth shatter against a wall of incomprehension. And it's not simply disagreement, but that their words destroy the cozy world built by others. This is the paradox. Society values conformity and unanimity above all else. There is an invisible framework that supports the functioning of society, and it rests on people's belief in certain illusions, that happiness lies in consumption, success in following the beaten path, and common sense is always infallible. People who dare to question these foundations are perceived as a hindrance, as a detail that falls out of the well-coordinated mechanism. History knows many examples of great thinkers who were rejected and ridiculed before their genius was recognized. Socrates accepted death for corrupting the youth, for his questions exposing the ignorance of those in power. Galileo Galilei was persecuted for asserting the obvious fact, the Earth's rotation around the sun. Friedrich Nietzsche was ridiculed and labeled insane for his challenge to Christian morality. Nikola Tesla died in obscurity while others basked in the glory, using his inventions. It is worth considering whether anything has changed today. Technology has come a long way, but human nature remains unchanged. And to this day, society tends to punish those who think unconventionally, who dare to swim against the tide. In the modern world, rejection doesn't manifest in the form of medieval persecution, but is still a tangible reality. It is expressed in social isolation, in the agonizing feeling of being misunderstood, in the difficulty of finding like-minded individuals who share your views on the world. And here the key question arises. Does the root of the problem lie in intelligence or in the surrounding world? It's likely that the real reason for the alienation of brilliant minds isn't a lack of communication skills, but rather that the truth is unacceptable to most people. What is obvious to a discerning eye is something others prefer to ignore. It is this deliberate unwillingness to see beyond the surface that creates an insurmountable barrier between the intellectual and the rest of the world. Society fears those who think independently more than anything else. The majority of people follow an unspoken script, repeating learned truths without subjecting them to critical analysis. This is why intellect does not bring people together, but rather pushes them apart. Consider this. When you meet someone who is physically superior to you, you may feel admiration. Seeing a wealthier person, you may feel envy, but rarely hostility. However, when you demonstrate superior intellect, the reaction of those around you is not admiration or envy, but resistance. After all, strength or wealth are external attributes, while intellect exposes something much more vulnerable, the limitations of others. The very presence of a deeply thinking person forces people to confront their own cognitive flaws, which is certainly unpleasant for anyone. The mind is like a mirror, reflecting the unsightly truths that many prefer not to notice. The narrowness of their views, the triviality of their conversations, and their immersion in a routine of distractions and conformity. The natural reaction of a person faced with discomfort is to attack or ignore. This is why thinkers are often seen as a threat to the social order. Arthur Schopenhauer noted that society not only rejects those who question its foundations, but also subjects them to a kind of punishment. In his opinion, the further a person moves away from accepted mediocrity, the more they feel loneliness, as most people avoid facing reality. In the modern world where convenience is valued above all else, truth becomes an unbearable burden. This rejection manifests itself not only in the intellectual sphere, but also in everyday details. If you express an interesting observation, people turn away, offer a new point of view, and the conversation switches to another topic. Notice patterns that no one wants to acknowledge, and you are immediately accused of negativity or excessive complexity. This is a subtle but constant process of gradual distancing that pushes a person to the periphery, simply because they see what others stubbornly refuse to notice. However, such rejection does not indicate that their views are wrong. On the contrary, it indicates an ability to see through the veil of illusions that keeps most people trapped in self-deception. Intellect often foreshadows isolation, and this is not always due to a conscious choice by wise minds. Rather, the world around us tends to reject those who think outside the box. If you have ever felt alienated because of your way of thinking, you have probably realized that loneliness is not always imposed from the outside. Often, it's a personal decision. At first, sincere attempts are made to connect, share ideas, and find like-minded people. However, over time, when interaction brings disappointment, seems superficial, or simply exhausting, the realization comes. Perhaps it is better to be alone with oneself. Arthur Schopenhauer argued that intellectuals prefer solitude not out of contempt for society, but because of an inner need. In his opinion, for deeply thinking people, the world often appears as a superficial spectacle where most only pretend to understand the essence of things that they have never questioned. Attempts to participate in this theater require excessive effort, and the return is minimal. Socialization often turns into disappointment from meaningless conversations, from the need to simplify one's thoughts in order to be understood. And then, alienation occurs. First, a person avoids certain social circles where their ideas are not appreciated. Then, they begin to choose their interlocutors more carefully, striving for conversations that have meaning. Ultimately, the understanding comes that the best sobesednik is one's own mind. Not out of contempt for others, but because of the feeling that they have little to offer except for fleeting entertainment. However, there is a hidden danger in this solitude. Seemingly a protection at first glance, This isolation can quickly turn into a real prison for the mind. The relentless thought process inherent in an analytical mind constantly revolves around questions and assessments. In the absence of an exchange of ideas with others, without intellectual stimulation, thought risks falling into a vicious circle, where everything makes sense only within the framework of a personal point of view. Intellect, while protecting from ignorance, is at the same time capable of imprisoning a person in their own cocoon of understanding. It is precisely at this moment that loneliness transforms into something deeper, a kind of psychological exile where the individual, even when surrounded by people, feels detached from everything. There may be interaction, laughter, and discussion of trivial matters, but deep down, there remains an awareness of the absence of something important. Genuine dialogue, a real exchange of ideas. The main tragedy of self-isolation lies in its apparent voluntariness. No one strives for complete solitude. But when the surrounding world offers only superficial connections, when communication becomes a burden rather than a source of joy, loneliness seems like the only logical choice. This is the paradox. The deeper the understanding of the world, the less space in it seems to remain for the one who understands. Why is such precious intellect so often rejected by society? Why are visionaries met with ridicule, disdain, and sometimes open hostility? The answer lies in the very structure of the world, which is oriented not towards thinkers, but towards conformists. Since time immemorial, society has favored those who unquestioningly follow established rules, not those who dare to question them. The education system, seemingly designed to develop the mind, often suppresses it. In schools, we are taught obedience, not independent thinking. We are taught to mechanically memorize information without subjecting it to critical analysis, to accept ready-made truths without bothering to verify them. A student who shows excessive curiosity and asks too many questions is seen as a troublemaker. In the workplace, an employee who proposes innovative changes is seen as a threat to the company's stability. A citizen who dares to challenge conventional wisdom is branded as a disturber of the peace. Arthur Schopenhauer, a perceptive philosopher, clearly recognized this trend. He argued that the world is dominated by a system of collective mediocrity, where independent thinking is seen as a potential danger. According to Schopenhauer, most people strive not for truth, but for comfort, and truth, as is known, is rarely pleasant. This explains the tragic fate of many great thinkers who were rejected by society before their genius was recognized. Socrates, an outstanding ancient Greek philosopher, was sentenced to death for daring to question the established values of Athenian society. Galileo Galilei, an Italian astronomer and physicist, was persecuted for his heliocentric theory, which asserted that the Earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around. Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher, was declared insane for his critique of Christian morality and his bold philosophical ideas. Even in our time, innovative thinkers are often discredited and ostracized before their ideas are recognized and widely adopted. Resistance to intellectual pursuit is not limited to prominent figures in the history of philosophy and science. It permeates everyday life, manifesting itself in ordinary situations. It is felt when the desire for deep discussion is met with detachment and impatience from those around. Alternative points of view are rejected without due consideration, and patterns that escape the attention of most are met with indifference instead of expected curiosity. The truth is that society not only does not value critical thinking, but also actively suppresses its manifestations. People prone to deep reflection pose a challenge to a system that seeks to control through conformism. They do not take ready-made narratives on faith and are not satisfied with simplified answers, which creates a threat to the established order. This is the deep paradox. Society needs thinkers for progress, but at the same time rejects them. It strives for the advantages that intellect brings, technological development, scientific discoveries, philosophical innovations, but avoids the discomfort that accompanies deep thinking. That is why those who are able to see further than others have always remained and will probably remain in the minority, lonely, but extremely important. Outstanding intellect not only leads to isolation but can also become a heavy burden. The pain is caused not only by rejection from society, but also by the very impact of deep understanding on the mind, which can be painful and exhausting. Arthur Schopenhauer pessimistically noted that in-depth knowledge of reality deprives a person of the ability to enjoy life. The masses prefer to live in a world of dreams, nourishing themselves with illusory hopes for the inner meaning of existence, the triumph of justice, and the inevitable reward for their efforts. Belief in predestination, lucky chance, and personal merit serves as their support, gives them a sense of purpose, and encourages them to move forward despite the vicissitudes of fate. However, a deep analysis and critical reflection on these established beliefs sooner or later lead a thinking person to a discouraging conclusion. All these convictions lack any guarantees. This is the fundamental difference between an ordinary person and a philosopher. The former finds solace in self-deception that makes them happy, while the latter sees the world in its unsightly nakedness, chaotic, indifferent, and full of contradictions. The philosopher realizes that morality is not an absolute truth, but merely a social construct, that the pursuit of happiness often turns into a pointless race for desires imposed by culture, and that most people seek not the truth, but only confirmation of their established views. However, it is here that intellect becomes a heavy burden, because once you have seen the truth, it is impossible to turn away from it. You cannot simply silence your mind and convince yourself of the meaningfulness of what is happening. The way back to serene ignorance is forbidden. As Nietzsche once remarked, a close look into the abyss inevitably leads to it beginning to look into you. This is the price for deep understanding, a growing sense of detachment from the world around you. While ordinary people rejoice over minor achievements, a new car model, a promotion, or a short-lived infatuation, a thinking person questions their true value. What is a source of satisfaction for most, in their eyes, looks like mere superficial vanity. And this feeling of alienation gradually increases until they begin to feel like an outcast in their own era. It is not surprising that many outstanding minds in human history suffered from melancholy and even deep depression. Pascal described the infinite silence of the universe as something terrifying. Kierkegaard spoke of the unbearable torments of loneliness and alienation. Kafka embodied this feeling in his literary works. Schopenhauer, perhaps the most pessimistic of all philosophers, saw life as an endless cycle of desires and disappointments, where the only salvation is complete renunciation of everything worldly. However, a pressing question arises. How is it possible to maintain peace of mind and not allow oneself to be consumed by the all-consuming truth? If the intellect ruthlessly tears away the veils of illusion, where is the line between serene ignorance and complete despair? It is this question that becomes the watershed between those who only suffer from their sharp mind and those who find ways to harness its power. Perhaps the key to the solution lies in accepting inevitable loneliness. If high intelligence inevitably leads to isolation, and deep penetration into the essence of things becomes an unbearable burden, what remains in a person's arsenal? How to avoid being absorbed by one's own mind for someone who is able to see beyond the superficial facade? Arthur Schopenhauer, an outstanding thinker, believed that the only way for an intellectual to find peace of mind is to accept their loneliness and direct their energy into a creative direction. He argued that extraordinary minds should not waste precious time on fruitless attempts to fit into a society that by its nature is unable to understand them. Instead, loneliness should be seen not as a punishment, but as a unique privilege. However, this path is not strewn with roses, because in the depths of their soul, every human being strives for communication and mutual understanding. Even the most intellectually independent personalities yearn to be understood, to find like-minded people who share their worldview and are capable of genuine dialogue. The problem is that such meetings are extremely rare, and the hope that society as a whole will appreciate the depth of thought is a utopia. What should be done in this situation? First, it is necessary to realize that intellectual loneliness is not equivalent to complete isolation. There are various ways to find like-minded people, whether through books, studying philosophy, participating in intellectual communities, or even through art. Many of the greatest minds in history led a secluded life, but their ideas outlived their era, thanks to the fact that they were recorded on paper, discussed, and ultimately recognized. Second, you should direct your intellect towards achieving meaningful goals. A mind that does not find challenges and does not have a clear goal quickly turns into a self-destructive trap. Creativity, scientific research, continuous learning, all this can turn the burden of intellect into a powerful tool. And finally, it is necessary to come to terms with the fact that the world will always resist those who think outside the box. Society rarely recognizes its great thinkers during their lifetime. Only after a while, when their ideas cease to be perceived as a threat, do they begin to be admired. Therefore, if you feel that you do not fit into the general framework, perhaps you are exactly where you should be. Have you ever felt alienated because of your unique perspective on the world, when those around you don't share your worldview? The author encourages readers to share their experiences and thoughts in the comments. Furthermore, the author urges the audience not to stop at just watching one video and suggests moving on to the next, implying that it will be a logical continuation of the topic and deepen the understanding of the issues raised. In conclusion, music plays, creating an atmosphere for further immersion in the